The truck came at first light, the way it always did. Every few weeks, when the mist still hung gold over the low pasture and the fence post dripped, a flatbed backed up to the far corner of Della Rourke's land and tipped a load of wool over the rail. Not good wool. The wool nobody would buy. Belly wool matted with burrs and seed, dung tag stiff as bark, short second cuts no spinner would ever touch, and grease yellow neck wool packed full of hay. The man who brought it was Hollis Tam, a broad-shouldered mill hand in a grease-stained ball cap and rubber boots, and he called the stuff skirtings. Most mornings he called it worse than that. Not worth the diesel to haul it to the dump, he said the first time she walked out to meet him. Your fence corner's closer. You mind? Della Rourke minded a great many things by then. She did not mind the wool. She was a lean woman in a canvas barn jacket with gray-streaked hair tied back under a wool cap, and she had watched most of her plans go sideways over the last few years. The dairy herd sold off in a bad stretch, the barn left half empty and echoing, her husband 3 winters gone, a heart attack out in the hayfield, and the bank calling twice a month about a note she could not seem to get ahead of. People in town had developed a way of looking at her, a soft, sorry look, that said as plain as speech that she was finished, written off. So when a man offered her something for nothing, even garbage, she said yes, and told him to come back whenever he liked. The pile grew. Through one autumn and into the next it grew, a greasy heap slumped against the wooden rails, steaming faintly on the cold mornings. It smelled of lanolin and manure and rain, a heavy animal smell that rode the wind toward the house. Neighbors made jokes about it at the feed store, about the widow Rourke and her mountain of filth. She heard them. She let the pile grow anyway, because something about all that wasted wool would not leave her be. Somebody had raised those sheep through a whole hard year. Somebody had sheared them, sweated over them, fed them through winter, and every bit of it ended up rotting at her fence because it was a half-inch too short and a shade too dirty to sell. There had been a time she cared what the town thought. Not anymore. Grief and hard money had burned that worry out of her, the way a hot rinse burns the grease out of a fleece, and left her with a strange, patient stubbornness. If the whole valley wanted to strike her name off its books, that was their arithmetic. Hers was simpler. She had land, 2 good hands, and a growing heap of something everyone else called worthless. A body could start from less. One gray afternoon she pulled a hank of it loose from the pile and carried it inside, holding it away from her coat. She washed it in the kitchen sink the way the library book told her to. Very hot water. A squirt of dish soap, no stirring, no swishing, nothing to shock it. Because wool, she read, felts if you agitate it, and she did not yet know that this warning held the whole secret sitting right there in front of her. The grease and grime ran off the color of strong tea. She drained it and filled the sink again and again, and by the 4th rinse the water ran nearly clear. What was left, blotted in a towel and drying by the stove, stopped her cold. Under all that filth the fiber was fine and soft and pale, crimped tight as a watch spring, springing back against her fingers. It was not garbage. It had only ever been treated like garbage. The trouble started when she tried to spin it. She had borrowed a wheel from a market seller and taught herself the basics off videos late at night. Long, clean wool drafted out smooth and easy in those videos. This wool did not. It was too short to hold a twist. It broke and clumped and pilled between her fingers, and by the end of a long evening she had half a bobbin of lumpy, sorry-looking yarn and a temper to match it. The wool nobody wanted, she was beginning to understand, had earned its reputation honestly. There were solid grounds for it coming off the truck as trash. That might have been the end of the whole notion, if not for Agnes Pruitt. Agnes Pruitt was a stout retired weaver with reading glasses on a beaded chain and ink-stained fingers, and she ran a booth 2 tables down at the Saturday market where Della sold eggs to make the note payment. She took one look at the sad little skein Della carried over to complain about and started to laugh, not unkindly, but from somewhere deep in the belly. "Honey, you're fighting it," she said. "This is not spinning wool. You will lose every single time. But you have got a truckload of the finest felting stock I have laid eyes on in 20 years, and here you are trying to make socks out of it." Felt, Della had heard the word somewhere. She had not thought about it once in her life. Agnes explained it at the kitchen table that same week, turning a worn scrap of gray felt over in her ink-stained fingers. Wool fiber, she said, is covered in tiny scales, like shingles laid down a roof. Spinning wants those scales to lie flat and slide past one another. Felting wants the exact opposite. Add heat, add water, add friction, and the scales stand up on end, catch on their neighbors, and lock, permanently, thousands of times over, all through the mass, until loose fluff becomes solid cloth that will never come apart again. And the wool that felts best of all, she said, is precisely the wool that spins worst. Short, crimped, a little coarse, half locked before you even lay a hand on it. Everything that makes this junk for a spinner, Agnes said, tapping a finger toward the pile through the window, makes it pure gold for a felter. They kept the long, clean stuff, and they threw away the good part. They threw the good part at your fence. That was the morning it turned all the way over in Della's head, and it never turned back. The flaw was the feature. The very thing that had branded the wool worthless at the mill was the thing that made it perfect for what she could do at her own sink with her own 2 hands. She was not sitting on a mountain of trash. She was sitting on a mountain of raw material that people paid real money for, and it was being delivered to her fence, sorted and stacked for free. She started small, because small was all she had. Dryer balls came first. She wound the clean wool into tight round balls the size of an orange, bound them snug in the foot of an old stocking, and ran them through the hot wash and the hot dryer until they came out hard and dense and round as river stones. They worked. Tossed in with a load of laundry, they knocked the damp apart, softened the sheets, and cut the drying time by 1/3, and they lasted for years instead of going in the trash like the boxes of chemical softener sheets she used to buy at the store. She made a dozen. Then she made 50. Her hands ached and cracked from the endless hot water, and she wrapped them at night and kept right on going. Insoles came next. She traced her boots onto layered bats of wool, wet them down warm, and rolled and rubbed and slapped them against the counter edge until the loose fiber fulled down into firm gray soles, thick and springy and dense. She slid a pair into her chore boots and wore them through the mud of a whole wet week, and every night they dried out soft and warm by the stove. Wool did that. It could be soaked to the skin and still hold heat. It could take a boot heel 1,000 times over and spring back for more. It forgave things. She was coming to admire that. Not everything worked. She wanted to be honest with herself about that, so she kept the failures where she could see them. There was the felting flop she would tell people about for years afterward. A big panel she rushed, too little friction, pulled from the water too soon, because she wanted it finished before dark, that looked perfect while it was wet, and then came apart in her hands the moment it dried, sloughing back into loose, useless fluff all across the kitchen floor. She had wanted it done. Felt does not care in the least what you want. It fulls on its own slow schedule, or it does not full at all, and there is no arguing with it and no shortcut through it. She learned to slow down. She learned that the work could be earned, but never hurried. Then there was the dye lot. She wanted color for the craft felt. Soft sheets of it she meant to sell to quilters and crafters by the yard, and she got ambitious too fast. A whole batch of pale, perfect felt went into a madder dye bath she had never once tested, and it came out streaked and muddy and blotched, an ugly, uneven brown pink that not one soul would buy. 40 sheets. A full week of work ruined in an afternoon. She hung them on the clothesline and stood looking at them a long while in the gold of the morning, and then she took them down and cut them into small squares and sold them as a discount grab bag for pennies on the dollar. Because a lean woman in a canvas barn jacket with gray-streaked hair tied back under a wool cap does not throw away a week of work twice in one life. After that, she tested every dye lot on a scrap first. The small mistakes she was learning were only tuition. You paid them once, and then you knew. By the following spring, she had a system, and the system had a rhythm to it. The raw wool came off the truck and went straight into mesh laundry bags. She scoured it in careful batches in an old utility sink she had plumbed into the barn, laid it to dry on window screens propped across sawhorses, and picked and teased the clean locks apart by hand in the long evenings while the radio played low. The dung tags she cut away and threw on the compost. The burrs she combed out one by one. What was left, clean, lofty, pale as cream, she carted into soft square bats and stacked them like loaves of bread along the shelves. The barn that had stood half empty and accusing for 3 long years slowly began to fill again. Not with animals this time, with inventory. Word moved the way it always moves in a small place, slow and then all at once. Agnes talked her up at the market to anyone who paused at the booth. A gift shop 2 towns over took a box of dryer balls on consignment and sold clean through it in a single week, then called back for 2 more boxes. A woman who ran a mail-order fiber shop out of her home found Della at a regional craft fair, ran her thumb slowly along the face of a gray, felt panel, felt the honest density of it, and asked in a low, careful voice whether Della could do real volume. Volume, Della nearly laughed out loud. She had a barn full of volume arriving at her fence for free every few weeks, rain or shine. The mail order was the thing that turned it from a hobby into a living. She set up a plain little shop online, 1 thumb-typed page at a time, photographed her goods laid out on a weathered barn board in the morning light, and started shipping. Dryer balls in sets of 3, tied with twine, insoles sorted and labeled by shoe size. Craft felt by the sheet in the muted, natural, earthy colors she had finally taught herself to get right. She packed every box herself at the kitchen table and wrote a short note by hand to slip inside each one, and she walked them to the post office in town with her chin a little higher than it had been in years. She would always remember the first order that came from a stranger, a set of 3 dryer balls, paid for by someone 2,000 miles off who had never heard her name, never seen her fence, never known a thing about the dairy or the note or the look the town gave her. Just someone who wanted less waste in a laundry room and had found, somehow, the goods a written-off woman made at her own kitchen sink. Della packed that box like it held eggs. She has packed a great many since. She has never quite lost the feeling of that first one. And then the acoustic panels, that was the order she never saw coming in 100 years. A man who built home recording booths ordered a single sample of her thick sound dampening felt, tested it against the foam he had always used, and came back a week later with an order for 200 panels and the promise of more. Wool absorbs sound the way it absorbs everything else, patiently and completely, and the dense waste fiber she once could not give away turned out to deaden a room beautifully, warmly, better than the store-bought foam ever had. He wanted them in the natural grays, no dye at all. He did not care in the slightest that they had begun their life as belly wool and dung tags at a dumping fence. He cared only that they worked. And they worked. The order book filled. She kept it in a plain spiral notebook on the corner of the kitchen table, and the lined pages filled up week by week with names and shoe sizes and panel counts and shipping dates, until one evening she sat down with a cup of coffee, turned through the pages, and understood with a small shock that she had more orders on the books than she could ever fill on her own 2 hands. She brought Agnes in 2 afternoons a week and paid her honest wages, and the 2 of them worked the long table together with the radio going and the wood stove ticking. One misty gold morning the flatbed came again, and Hollis Tam, a broad-shouldered mill hand in a grease-stained ball cap and rubber boots, climbed down from the cab and stood a while looking at the fence corner. The pile was gone. Not rotted into the mud, gone, moved into the barn, scoured and carted and fulled and boxed, shipped clear across the country. He scratched at his neck under the brim of the cap. "Where's it all been going?" he finally asked. She told him. She walked him into the barn and showed him the notebook and the shelves of pale bats. She showed him a box packed and taped for the recording booth man, a set of dryer balls bound for a city 3 states off, a neat stack of gray acoustic panels waiting on the pallet by the door. Hollis Tam turned a single dryer ball over and over in his big, grease-marked hands, the same slow way Agnes had turned that first scrap of felt at the kitchen table, and for a good while he did not say anything at all. "We pay to get rid of this, you know," he said at last. "Tipping fee at the transfer station. Every single load. Been paying it for years, just to make it somebody else's problem." "I know," Della said. "I figured as much. You want all of it then? Steady? Every load we cut?" "All of it," she said. "Every load. And you can tell the other outfits down the valley to bring me theirs too." They shook hands on it right there at the fence, in the gold and the mist. What had been his cost became her supply, steady, sorted, endless, and free. What had been her fence corner shame became the first solid link in a real business with a name over the door and a notebook full of orders inside. He still grumbled about the drive. He still called the stuff skirtings out of pure habit. But he brought it faithfully, every load, and one cold morning he carried his own muddy boots in under his arm and asked her, a little sheepish about it, whether she might make insoles in his size. She did. She made him a good thick pair from the very same wool he had once sworn was not worth the diesel to haul to the dump. The man from the bank stopped calling. One afternoon he drove out instead, stood in the yard in his town shoes, and looked at the pallet of boxes and the full barn and the tidy little sign she had lettered over the door. He did not say he had been wrong about her. Men like that rarely do. But he shook her hand before he left, and the notes got paid down, one by one, out of a heap of wool he would once have told her to burn. She wears a wool cap through every winter now, and if you were to ask her about it, she would tell you plainly that she felt it herself. From the first clean batch she ever managed to get exactly right, the batch that finally taught her, for good, that the flaw was the feature all along. On the misty gold morning she still walks out to the fence when she hears the truck. The pile still lands against the old wooden rails, greasy and gray and steaming in the cold. But the neighbors do not joke about it at the feed store anymore. They have watched the shipping boxes stack up by her door, one hard one year into the next, and a few of them have quietly started saving their own bags of waste wool to bring by. The wool that nobody wanted built her a living and gave her back her name. It was never once garbage. It had only ever been waiting, the way she had been waiting, for someone the whole world had already written off to walk out to the fence on a gold and misty morning look at the heap of it twice, and see clear as day what it could still become.